This is my true story. I built a life with my own hands so my son could live without fear. I carried him through sickness, paid his debts, and gave him a roof that kept him warm. But one night, at the very table I bought, he leaned forward and spat. "Shut up, beggar, or go live on the streets." His friends laughed while my heart cracked. I didn't cry, I didn't shout. I just looked at him and stayed silent. He didn't know what I was going to do next. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so more people hear my story. I gave him everything I never had. When he was small, I carried him on my shoulders through the rain so his shoes would stay dry. When he was hungry, I skipped meals so he could eat. I worked 2 jobs, one at the factory during the day, one at the warehouse at night. My hands stayed cracked and bleeding from lifting boxes that didn't belong to me, but I told myself it was worth it. Every paycheck went to his school fees, his books, his dreams. I fixed his first bicycle with old parts I found at the junkyard. I stayed up nights teaching him how to read when he was too restless for homework. I believed that a father's job was to give, not to question what came back. When he grew older, I co-signed his first loan so he could buy a car. He told me, "You don't have to, Dad." But I saw the way he smiled when he drove off. That smile was worth the paperwork. I paid half the down payment on his house, the same one he would one day call his. I thought it was right. I wanted him to stand tall, to have something to build on. I even helped pay for his wedding, bought new clothes so I wouldn't embarrass him at the reception, and sat quietly in the corner while his friends toasted to his success. Every time someone said, "He made it on his own," I smiled. I didn't want credit. I only wanted peace. For years, I thought the roof I built would be the one place I could rest. I imagined my old age spent in that house, hearing laughter in the evenings, maybe holding my grandchildren one day. But as he got richer, something inside him changed. His words grew shorter. His tone sharpened. The man who used to say, "Thank you, Dad," began to sigh when I spoke, roll his eyes when I forgot things, and walk away when I asked small favors. The house began to feel smaller. The table where we used to eat together turned into his stage. His wife started joining in with the small insults, the quiet snickers when I spilled something or forgot a word. I told myself to ignore it. I told myself, "He's stressed. He doesn't mean it." I gave him excuses because I was afraid of losing him. But each time I excused him, he learned how far he could push. When I asked about my name on the deed once, he laughed. "Don't worry, Dad. Everything's under control." I trusted him, not because I was foolish, but because I still believed blood meant something. I didn't realize that love doesn't always go both ways. I had raised a man who saw kindness as weakness and respect as optional. He lived like a king under my roof. The bills were still in my name, the property tax still withdrawn from my account. I didn't complain. I told myself it was enough to see him happy, even if I had to stretch my pension to cover his mistakes. I thought one day he'd see the truth, that everything he stood on was made of my labor. But that day never came. Instead, what came was contempt, quiet at first, then louder, sharper, crueler. And I realized too late that the roof I built to protect him had turned into a cage for me. Every kindness I gave had been turned into a leash he used to pull me down. He had eaten my patience, worn my sacrifice, and slept under my hard work. And one day, he would stand at the same table, surrounded by people I once fed, and call me a beggar. I didn't know it yet, but the years I lent him were about to end. And I would collect every debt, not with words, but with action. It was a Saturday night. The house smelled of food I had cooked, though no one thanked me for it. He had friends over. Men in fine shirts, loud laughter, and heavy perfume of success. They sat around the table I had built years ago, eating on plates I had bought when he couldn't afford his own. I sat quietly in the corner, listening to them talk about business, cars, money. They laughed about people who had nothing. They laughed like men who thought life would never humble them. At first, he ignored me. I was a shadow in the room, invisible to everyone except when the glass needed filling or when a plate needed to be cleared. Then, halfway through the evening, I asked him softly if I could borrow the car the next morning to go to the clinic. My knees had been hurting for weeks, and the hospital was too far to walk. That small question was enough. He turned, his face already twisting, like my voice was something filthy that had interrupted his world. He said it slowly, in front of everyone, so they could hear, "Shut up, beggar, go live on the streets." The room went still for a second. Then someone laughed. One of his friends, the one who always looked at me with pity and mockery mixed together. Then another laugh followed. Soon the table was full of noise, full of people pretending it was funny. My son leaned back in his chair, smiling, proud of the cruelty that had just left his mouth. His wife looked at me, not with guilt, but with disgust. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there and looked at him. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. It was as if my soul had stepped outside my body and was watching the scene from somewhere else. The words hung in the air like smoke, staining everything they touched. Beggar. That was what I had become in his eyes. Not a father, not the man who raised him, but a beggar in his house. I looked around that table and saw faces that had once smiled at me, eaten my food, asked for my advice. Not one of them said a word. Not one told him to stop. They just watched, waiting for me to react, waiting to see if I would explode. But I didn't. I stayed silent. I realized then that my silence was my last weapon. He expected me to fight. He wanted to see me shout, to confirm his story that I was a burden, a nuisance. But I wouldn't give him that. So I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. I looked at the plates, the food, the drinks. Everything he had, everything that filled this house, came from me. The tiles, the lights, the walls, all mine. He just lived here, believing it was his. I felt something cold and sharp move through me. Not pain, not sadness, but clarity. I understood that night that there is no lower place for a father than begging for respect from his own son. I didn't say a word. I just walked to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed. I could still hear their laughter echoing through the walls. But the echo didn't hurt anymore. It just reminded me that I had one last thing left. Control. Not over him, but over the house, over the papers, over what was truly mine. That night, the humiliation became the line I would never let him cross again. I didn't sleep. I sat awake until dawn, staring at the old drawer where I kept the documents, deeds, bank records, legal papers. I thought about every signature I had ever made, every form I had ever filled out. The next time he saw me quiet, it would not be because I was weak. It would be because I had already decided exactly how to end his arrogance, with ink, not anger. That night changed me. I sat in the dark with the door closed, the sound of their laughter still echoing faintly through the walls. For years, I had been the quiet man who swallowed disrespect for the sake of peace. I had endured the rolled eyes, the sharp words, the small humiliations that came like drops of acid. But something inside me broke clean that evening. Not from rage, from clarity. I finally understood what kind of man my son had become and what kind of man I would have to be to stop him from stepping on me again. I didn't throw a plate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give him the reaction he wanted. I sat there and began to count, not memories, but documents. I thought of every paper I had ever signed, every favor I had ever granted. The deed to the house, the accounts still tied to my name, the policies, the savings he never knew existed because he never cared to ask. I remembered all the times he had said, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll handle it." I realized that what he was handling was my life, and now it was time to take it back. I stood up and opened the drawer. Inside were files wrapped in dust, old envelopes marked with my handwriting, stamped with banks that had long changed names. I began to sort through them one by one. My old lawyer's card was still there. The last time I had called him was to add my son's name to the property. I had done it out of pride, thinking it was the right thing to do. Now I would call him again, to take it back. I made a list, the property deed, the bank accounts, the power of attorney I had given him years ago, just in case. I wasn't thinking like a victim anymore. I was thinking like a man preparing for war, A war without weapons, only words and paper. Every insult, every moment he made me feel small, now had a price tag attached. I didn't want revenge that could be undone. I wanted something that would stay final, that no apology could rewrite. I spent the next morning in silence. When he left for work, I made my call. My lawyer's voice hadn't changed, calm, slow, professional. I told him I needed to meet. He asked if it was urgent. I said, "It's about my house." That was enough. We set a time. I hung up and sat there for a while, my heart steady, my hands still. For the first time in years, I wasn't trembling. I wasn't waiting for his mood to decide my day. That evening, I ate dinner alone. The house felt colder, emptier, but lighter somehow. I had made my decision. The man who had called me Beggar would soon learn who the real owner was. I didn't plan to scream or curse or demand respect. I would let the papers speak for me. I would let the law do what my voice never could. I looked around the room once more, the furniture I bought, the walls I painted, the home I built, and I smiled, because now I wasn't just his father. I was the man who held the final card. The humiliation had turned into power, and my silence had turned into strategy. The next time he laughed in my face, it would be in a house that no longer belonged to him. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. The plan was simple, and the path was clear. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his love. I only needed to do what I should have done long ago: reclaim my life. I went to the lawyer the next day. He knew me by sight. He did not expect storms from an old man. I sat in his small office and placed the files on the table. I told him I wanted things changed. I said it plain and slow. He asked questions. I answered. No loud talk, no drama, just paper and clear steps. We read the deeds, the account forms, and the old powers of attorney. Some of the papers were faded at the edges. Some stamps were old. But they were real. They showed my name where his name should have been. They showed dates and signatures that no court could ignore. The lawyer pointed to lines that gave me the right to move money, to remove names, to close shared access. He explained how to do each step so nothing could be reversed by a later plea. I listened and followed. I did not rush. Law moves slowly, and slow is safe when you are reclaiming what is yours. We prepared new documents. Transfers were drafted. Accounts were split. The lawyer wrote letters to banks and tax offices and to the title office. Each page carried official words that would not bend under pressure. I signed where needed. My hand felt steady. It surprised me to feel steady. I had thought anger would make me tremble, but a calm decision was stronger. The lawyer sealed envelopes and made copies. He told me to keep a folder and never lose it. I put the copies in my jacket and felt the weight like armor. Before I left the office, the lawyer warned me gently. "This will hurt him," he said. "You will not enjoy the moment. People will judge you." I looked at him and said, "I have been judged already." That was all. My only aim was to stop being used. I did not want to make a show. I wanted to be done. He told me to be careful with the timing. Paper done right can be final. Paper done wrong can come back. So we followed the steps he set. No leaks, no talk, no excuses. Over the next few days, I did quiet things. I called banks and asked for forms. I signed where the law required. I canceled joint access. I moved funds into accounts that required only my name for access. I transferred titles so the ownership would read clearly. Every call I made was calm. Every signature I gave was steady. I took no joy in it, but I felt a relief I had not known in years. The law had turned from a distant rule into my shield. I did not tell the family. I did not warn him. He went on with his life, proud and sure. He bragged to friends about plans and deals. He never checked his mail carefully. He never read the letters that arrived in his name. That carelessness helped. He had counted on my silence and my habit of fixing messes. He never learned to watch what was under his feet. When the transfers were set, the lawyer put every final paper in a folder with a rubber band. He told me, "Now it is done. You have made your move. The law will hold." I nodded and paid his fee. We shook hands like two people who had finished a job. I walked out into the street with the folder in my hand and the sun on my face. It felt like the first day I had a real choice in years. The paper gave me power, without violence. It gave me an exit without noise. I had used the quiet tools of law to make a clean break. That strength felt strange at first. I had spent my life building a house and a family. Now I used the same building blocks to protect myself. The papers were not an act of cruelty. They were an act of survival. I would not be a beggar in my own home. I would not be the butt of jokes. The law was blunt and fair. I followed it, and it followed me back. When I returned home, the house looked the same. The only difference was that I no longer carried the fear that had lived in my chest for years. The drawer where I had kept papers now held new pages. The house still had his boots by the door and his laughter in the rooms, but the keys I had kept were no longer the only things that mattered. The paper did. The paper was my quiet strength. They were still asleep when I left for the lawyer's office that morning. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the slow ticking of the clock in the hallway. I looked once at the closed doors, his, hers, and felt nothing. No hate, no sadness, just a strange calm. I made tea, drank it in silence, and waited until the sun reached the windows. It was time. At the office, everything was already prepared. The lawyer greeted me with a nod and handed me the final documents. The new ownership transfers, the property reassignment, the bank instructions. Everything written in the clean, cold language of law. I read every line carefully, not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted to feel every word. Each page felt like a quiet breath after years of choking. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake this time. The signature came out clear and steady. One line, one date, one final confirmation. I had signed 1,000 things for my son. Permissions, loans, approvals, endless favors. This was the first thing I had ever signed against him. The notary stamped it, pressed the seal into the paper, and slid it across the table for my copy. That sound, the small click of the stamp, felt like thunder inside me. No shouting, no fights, no witnesses. Just paper, ink, and the end of an illusion. When I walked out, the documents were done. The house, the account, the savings, all mine again. He wouldn't know it yet. He'd wake up thinking he was still a king in a castle he had built. But the castle had already changed hands. I walked back home slowly. The morning air was cool. The world outside was just the same. Buses passing, shopkeepers opening their shutters, children running late for school. None of them knew what had just happened, what small shift had rewritten the life of a man who thought he was untouchable. I reached the gate, unlocked the door, and went inside. The house looked peaceful, as if it had been waiting for me to reclaim it. I walked through each room, touching the walls, remembering the years I had spent painting, fixing, and repairing every corner. I had built this place for love, not for pride. But love had turned into pity, and pity had turned into disrespect. Now the house was finally clean, not just from dust, but from contempt. He and his wife were still sleeping when I left again. I didn't want to see their faces. I didn't want a confrontation that would ruin the silence I had earned. I slipped the new documents into my jacket, locked the front door, and dropped the spare keys into my pocket. I stood there for one moment longer, listening to the faint rhythm of their sleep upstairs. Peaceful, ignorant. By the time they woke, their lives would be changed in ways they could not imagine. The bank would freeze their access. The property office would register the new deed. The utilities would shift. The law would close its circle quietly, without a single raised voice. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe an explanation. He had told me to shut up. And that's exactly what I had done. I had shut up. I had gone silent. But my silence had moved faster and cut deeper than any scream ever could. When I stepped outside the gate, the sun was brighter than usual. I didn't look back. I walked down the road like any other old man, invisible to the world, carrying nothing but a folder and peace. He was still asleep when I walked away, dreaming of control he no longer had. By the time he opened his eyes, the house would already belong to someone else, me. He came home just before dusk, drunk on his own pride, dragging the scent of arrogance through the doorway I once built with cracked hands. He didn't notice the subtle difference in the lock or the way the curtains no longer swayed with a sense of belonging. He walked straight in, expecting comfort, the same comfort he'd spat on, expecting dinner waiting, lights warm, air thick with the security I had provided. But comfort had expired. It ended the moment he called me beggar. The house no longer recognized him. It had become a stranger's property, stripped of his name, cleansed of his entitlement. I watched from across the street, leaning on my cane, unseen in the dim glow of a street lamp. The eviction team had arrived before him. Men in uniforms carried boxes and documents. One read the new deed aloud like scripture. My signature sat at the bottom, silent but absolute. Every sound that reached my ears was justice measured in paperwork. Doors unlocking to new owners, furniture tagged, laughter replaced by disbelief. He pushed past them, shouting, waving his arms, but the law doesn't bend for tantrums. The neighbors watched, whispering, remembering the night he called me worthless. I wondered if their hearts burned as quietly as mine. Inside, he shouted my name, thinking the echo might summon the old man he used to command. But the echo only mocked him. He stomped through empty rooms, walls bare, drawers cleaned out. The clock I once wound each night was gone, sold with the rest. Every tick that used to fill the silence was now ticking somewhere else. Mine. The sound he heard instead was the flat slap of reality. Ownership is not love, and inheritance is not guaranteed. He begged the men for explanations, waving his phone as if it could change the ink on the documents. "There's a mistake," he said, voice cracking. But signatures don't make mistakes. Notarized truth stands taller than pride. The officer at the door simply pointed to the papers, his tone even. "Your father sold it." "You need to vacate." Those words landed harder than any punch he'd ever thrown my way. For the first time in years, he understood what silence could do. The house that once fed his arrogance now stood cold, its warmth reclaimed by law and justice. The walls seemed to sigh, relieved to no longer shelter contempt. I saw his wife clutch her purse, eyes darting, realizing luxury was evaporating. The friends who once laughed at my humility looked away, pretending they hadn't heard. No one defended him. No one argued. He was alone, surrounded by the proof of his own cruelty. When I finally turned to leave, I didn't smile, didn't gloat. The wind bit my face, sharp and clean, reminding me of freedom. The last glimpse I took of that house wasn't of revenge fulfilled. It was peace, reclaimed. Everything he ever called his was built on my labor, my sacrifices, my faith that blood means gratitude. Now all of it belonged to no one but fate. I walked away quietly, shoes scraping against the pavement, leaving behind the son who thought words couldn't wound the man who made him. He shouted one last time, voice breaking through the air like glass. "Old man, where are you?" But I didn't turn around. There are moments in life when turning back means losing everything you've learned. That night, I chose to keep walking, past the noise, past the memory, into the emptiness that felt more honest than any love he'd ever shown. The night before my flight, I sat on the edge of the bed that had carried too many memories. The room smelled faintly of varnish and dust, the kind of scent that clings to old houses and long-kept promises. I didn't rush. Men like me don't need to hurry. We've already waited a lifetime. I folded each shirt with deliberate calm, not as clothing, but as a record of years, creases that told stories no one cared to hear. My hands moved steady, tracing the fabric as if it were a timeline. Every thread was proof that I had lived quietly, given endlessly, and been discarded publicly. The suitcase at my feet wasn't large. It didn't need to be. Freedom travels light. Inside went a photograph of my wife, a pocket watch that no longer ticked, one worn coat, and the bank documents that now carried my name alone. I ran my finger across the embossed seal. It felt cold, final, righteous. The papers didn't just represent money. They represented correction, justice. A man stripped of dignity had turned it into weaponry written in ink. Outside, the street hummed with the leftover life of others. Cars passing, televisions behind curtains, laughter in houses that still had fathers who were respected. I listened not with envy, but with distance. My story had ended there, among people who had once called me weak. I stood, adjusted my collar, and looked once more around the room. The walls were bare, but the air was full of release. Everything left behind, chairs, frames, plates, belonged to the ghosts of an old life. None of it was worth taking. I moved through the house one last time, touching the wooden rail I'd sanded smooth when he was a boy. My palm left a faint mark of warmth on it, a final signature. The hallway light buzzed low. I didn't turn it off. Let it burn itself out, the way patience does. In the kitchen, I stopped before the window that faced the street and saw nothing but reflection. For years, that reflection looked tired, defeated. That night, it looked calm, unafraid. When the clock struck midnight, I zipped the suitcase. The sound was small but absolute, the sound of a man sealing the past. I walked toward the front door, paused, and exhaled. The key turned with the same metallic click I'd heard when signing the sale. Short, final, irreversible. I placed the key on the hook, not in my pocket. That house was no longer mine to enter, only mine to end. The air outside was cool, damp with the promise of distance. A taxi waited by the curb, headlights washing pale light over the pavement. The driver didn't ask questions. Old men leaving at midnight don't invite curiosity. He simply lifted my bag into the trunk and nodded. As the car rolled forward, the tires whispered against the road, and the house shrank in the mirror until it was only shadow. At the airport, I sat in silence among strangers. They scrolled through phones, sipped coffee, laughed softly, people unscarred by betrayal. I envied none of them. I had something they didn't. Closure that cost everything but bought peace. When my flight number echoed through the terminal, I rose without hesitation. The world outside was wide again. The air smelled like fuel and possibility. As the plane lifted, I didn't look down. I didn't need to see the city vanish beneath clouds to know I'd already left. Somewhere below, my son would wake to another morning of loss, standing in front of a locked door, learning that cruelty is expensive. I imagined him shouting again, this time to no one. But that sound would never reach me. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the engines carry me toward a horizon where no one knew my name. There was no triumph in my chest, only quiet. The kind of quiet that finally feels like justice. He woke to noise he did not control. The first letter came like a cold hand. A formal notice slid under the door, stamped and final. He thought it was a mistake at first. Then the calls began. Banks, agents, lawyers reading lines he had never cared to read. Each voice said the same thing. Access denied, account frozen, ownership reassigned. The phone became a drumbeat of failure. He called friends. They answered slow, then stopped answering at all. Those who once cheered his jokes now pretended they did not know him. Pride is loud until it becomes empty. Word moved faster than he could. Neighbors saw the men carrying boxes and assumed some family dispute. Whispers traveled from garden gate to shop corner. People who had once smiled over his parties now crossed the street to avoid his eyes. He stood on the sidewalk watching the truck take what he thought was his, and the world he knew contracted to the size of a signature. His wife watched the papers with a face that went cold and small. The luxury she counted on was a story collapsing in front of her. She had laughed at my silence, but now she watched silence do what laughter could not undo. Creditors opened files, and the polite calls turned to blunt demands. Payments bounced. Cards declined at the corner store. Plans he had boasted about, trips, a new car, renovations, evaporated in a day. The same supermarkets that once handed him loyalty discounts sent warnings. Invitations stopped arriving. A few calls came that were not hostile, but practical, about changing utility accounts and scheduled services that now needed new names. Reminders that life runs on paperwork, and paperwork had chosen me. He tried to fight back with noise. He shouted at agents on the phone and pounded on doors. He posted bitter messages online, calling me a traitor and blaming the lawyer. People read, scrolled, and either scorned him or looked away. His words could not change ink already stamped and filed. Men who used to ask him to host weekend barbecues now ducked past his gate. The dinner guests who once applauded his jokes no longer came. Humiliation multiplied not from one act, but from a slow, public unraveling that left him exposed in small ways. A failed payment at a shop, a neighbor nod that stopped, a former friend declining to help. He called relatives begging for help and found excuses instead. "We hadn't realized," they said. "We thought everything was fine." The thinness of those replies hit him like a new kind of cold. Blood ties are easy to demand until a paper proves otherwise. His wife packed a few bags and left for her mother's house, leaving him with empty rooms and a phone that kept ringing with demands he could not satisfy. The laughter in his life turned into silence, and silence became the loudest punishment. Pride often hides in public. When the public turns, pride falls in public too. He learned that day what it is to be small in the eyes of many. He lost more than money. He lost standing. People who once sought his company now clucked their tongues and gave him space. Creditors came with forms. Agents read clauses. Lawyers spoke of limitations. The doors that once opened without question now asked for permission and proof he no longer had. At night, he sat alone in a house full of echoes. The same rooms that had once warmed his boasts now hissed with the memory of things he had taken for granted. The bills stacked in corners like accusations. Each envelope was a ledger page of debts owed not only in money but in trust. He shouted at the walls and found only his voice returning, smaller each time. His world had been built on my labor, and when that foundation moved, everything above it collapsed. The lesson landed slow and hard. You cannot mock what holds you up without risking the fall. He learned it not with a single blow, but with the steady, grinding truth of paperwork and people turning away. In the end, the fallout was quiet and total, and it left him with nothing to say that could change the past. Far away from that house, mornings no longer began with tension. I woke to the hum of a city that did not know my name, where the air smelled of bread and fuel instead of resentment. I rented a small flat above a cafe, its window cracked open to the chatter of strangers. No one asked what I had left behind. They only nodded politely, poured my coffee, and moved on. For the first time in years, I could breathe without waiting for insults to fill the silence. I learned that peace does not shout. It whispers. It lives in small rituals, folding laundry without hearing criticism, watching the light fall across the floor, counting coins that belong entirely to me. I didn't buy new things. I didn't need them. I had already bought enough in my lifetime to understand how little ownership means when respect is gone. My wealth was in the quiet. The kind that money cannot steal. Sometimes at night, I'd catch myself remembering the old house, the echo of footsteps on the wooden stairs, the ticking clock that marked every decade of sacrifice. There was pain in those memories, yes, but also release. Pain becomes lighter when no one is there to keep adding to it. I'd picture my son standing where I once stood, bewildered by absence, and I'd feel nothing sharp, just distance. He had chosen mockery over gratitude, arrogance over love. The punishment was not my doing anymore. It was life finishing what pride had started. The neighbors in my new street didn't know my story. They greeted me as "Sir" and left it at that. The baker saved the crust of warm bread for me. The newspaper boy waved every morning. It was a small world, but it was mine. I walked through markets without fear of humiliation. I was no longer someone's burden. No longer a target for cruelty disguised as humor. Every step away from that old house was a step toward becoming whole again. I didn't follow the news from home. I didn't check the property listings or bank alerts. The past didn't deserve updates. What mattered was that my hands, once shaking from anger, now trembled only from age. And even that no longer felt like weakness. It felt like proof I had survived something most people wouldn't. I had lived through betrayal and come out with dignity intact. That was wealth enough. In quiet moments, I'd take out the photograph of my wife and set it beside the window. She had always told me, "Respect is the only real inheritance." Back then, I didn't understand. I thought inheritance was about houses and accounts, about giving comfort to those we raise. Now I understood she was right. I had given everything material and received nothing but contempt. In leaving, I gave myself the respect no one else would. The loneliness came sometimes, sudden and sharp, like a draft through a door you thought was closed. But it was honest loneliness, not humiliation disguised as company. I filled it with simple things, reading old books, writing letters I never sent, listening to the rain on the roof. There was no sound of mockery, no footsteps of someone waiting to command or belittle, just the rhythm of a life finally my own. Months passed, the seasons turned, and the guilt that used to eat me from the inside faded, replaced by something quieter: acceptance. I had done what needed to be done, not for revenge, but for restoration. The house was gone, the money secure, the cycle broken. I no longer needed anyone to witness my pain. I had turned it into silence, and silence was enough. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. And freedom, I learned, doesn't roar, it exhales. He once told me to go live on the streets. Now, I live somewhere he'll never find. I've seen the sunrise in another land, where no one knows my name and no one dares raise their voice to me. The air here is calm, clean of cruelty. I walk through narrow markets where people smile without reason, and I realize how light life can feel when you leave behind those who made you heavy. I didn't leave to punish him. I left because staying meant slowly dying among people who mistook kindness for weakness. I think sometimes about that night, the way he looked at me with disgust, the way his friends laughed. I remember the sting in my chest, the blur in my vision, the taste of silence when I decided not to answer back. That silence became my weapon. Every insult, every sneer, every word he threw at me. It all became fuel for the quietest act of revenge a man can make: walking away with everything. I never raised my voice. I never explained myself. I simply took back what was mine, piece by piece, until the world he stood on had nothing left beneath it. He called me beggar. But the truth is, I was the builder. I built the walls that kept him safe. I paid for the doors he slammed in my face. I put food on the plates he laughed over. And when he told me to leave, I obeyed. Not as a beaten man, but as one who finally understood value. I sold the house he worshipped and left him nothing but echoes and unpaid bills. He taught me what it feels like to be small. I taught him what it feels like to lose everything. In this new place, I don't look over my shoulder. I don't check the mail or fear what might come. I have peace now. The kind of peace that doesn't need applause or revenge stories. Sometimes I sit by the window, drink tea, and think about how people destroy themselves by forgetting who helped them stand. My son didn't lose a house. He lost a father who loved him more than his own pride. That is the real bankruptcy. Final line: he called me beggar. I sold the house that sheltered his arrogance, and I left the country, never to return.